Boston has met a goal ahead of schedule on supportive housing for the homeless. 2 years ago, Mayor Walsh said he wanted to raise $10 million in 4 years for Boston's Way Home Fund. The fund was set up in partnership with Bank of America and the housing nonprofit Pine Street Inn. To tell us about the initiative is the executive director of Pine Street Inn, Lyndia Downie. Thank you very much for being with us, Lyndia.
Happy to be here.
I'll congratulate you on the funding, but I first want to ask you about maybe this sort of superficial big picture of what homelessness is like in Boston. Compared with some other cities where you would think they have more resources, things seem to be worse there than here. So how do you account for that?
Well, you know, Boston has actually, as of this year, the lowest street count in the country compared to other cities of our size. And about 2% of the homeless people in Boston actually stay outside. And of course, we'd like that to be 0%, frankly. But 2% is a relatively small number compared to places like Seattle and San Francisco, where they're reaching 50%. Almost half the homeless people in those cities are actually sleeping out in encampments, in tents, on sidewalks. So Boston has done, relatively speaking, a good job. Not by accident. It's been, I think, a lot of deliberate strategy, putting a lot of money into outreach and putting a lot of money into supportive housing. Some people say to me it's the weather, but the weather doesn't account for that alone. Even if you doubled our number from 2% to 4%, we'd still be one of the lowest in the country.
Now, exactly which part of the homeless population was this fund most concerned with?
So, yeah, this fund really was created to help people who have been homeless for at least a year and have a disability. And they're people we call chronically homeless, which means they're homeless, they have a very low income and won't be able to afford rent in the market, and the market won't ever build housing for them. But this group in particular has, often struggling with mental health issues, substance use. A lot of people in that group that are very medically frail, that have lost their housing sometimes because they got sick and they couldn't pay the rent anymore, even if they had health insurance, they weren't working. So it's targeted for the group of people for whom there is no other housing option.
Well, part of the strategy is an idea, I don't think it's really new anymore, but it's still controversial for some people, and that's housing first. I know I oversimplified that, but what does that mean exactly?
It means instead of trying to get people to fix everything first, that we're going to put them in housing and bring the services to them. So it's the entry into the housing is lower barrier, which means the screening is, we try to remove as many barriers as we can to help people get into their own apartment, their own room. And then we and other providers bring the services into your housing unit. And that's everything from, now that you've moved off the streets and into housing, how are we going to help you shop wisely? How are you going to cook for yourself again? Do you know how to use a washer and dryer? Sounds like simple stuff. To the much more complicated things like, how do we make sure you have primary care? How do we get you connected with mental health services if you need it? How do we get you to start a job search and support you in that job search? So it's small things for adjustment, and then the big life-changing things as well.
Well, you start with this principle of housing first, but you've also pulled off, I guess, what you call a redesign of services. I guess that means you've learned some things along the way and decided to do some things differently.
I would say that we, last year, Pine Street Inn in our own housing, we had a 91% retention rate in our housing, which meant 91% of the tenants we placed were still there a year later. And the reason for that is the support services we provide. We have been on a trajectory now for the past 10 years where we have been moving away from shelter and investing more in supportive housing, because we know it's the solution to homelessness for a certain group of homeless people. And we know with those kind of retention rates, it really works, because 100% of those people were homeless before they moved into housing. What I will say is that there are thousands of people who go through shelter in the city of Boston every year. Most of them don't need supportive housing. They need some help maybe with first and last month's rent. They might need some help finding a place and getting a roommate. They might need help securing housing and getting a second job so they can pay the rent, but they don't need deep, deep support. So the group we're focused on needs deep, deep support to hold on to their housing, but lots of people get through and out of homelessness in a much shorter period of time with what I would call, some flexible funding. Everything from, again, first and last month's rent to, I have first and last month's rent, but once I put that down, I might need a couple $100s a month until I can get a second job or a roommate. So we have a fund that actually provides that as well for people.
It sounds like you have a whole spectrum here. I know it's always more than a quick fix, but and you might have some people at the far end who are going to need supportive housing indefinitely, but I guess it sounds like there are a lot of people who go from supportive to something else too.
We do. We have a number of people who move out of supportive housing who really stabilize in housing, and you know, we have a matrix that we use, and every month we look at how each tenant is doing, and if it looks like you're doing really well, we're going to start the conversation with you around, look, you're paying the rent, you're working, seems like things are going well. Do you want to stay in a single room? You know, would you like to try and find different housing? Maybe you want to move out of the city where there might be some more housing options. And so we've been on a regular basis trying to get people to enroll in what we call this Moving On program, helping them find other units, giving them a little bit of support as they adjust into this new housing, but then really pulling back and we've only placed a small number of people in that Moving On program, but everybody so far has held on to their housing.
This has been a news. We're talking with Lyndia Downie from Pine Street Inn. Lyndia, what about the fact that you met the funding goal as quickly as you did? I mean, was this too modest a goal to begin with, maybe, or did something interesting happen?
You know, I would say two things. You know, when the mayor decided not to have an inaugural party in his second term, he called the bank, and Bank of America, and he called us and said, look, I'd like to ask people if they would support a fund so we can build 200 additional units of housing. And the mayor said 2 years, and I said 4 years, because you know, fundraising is hard. It does take time, and it takes time to build momentum and get your message out there. And also, you know, we were doing this on top of other fundraising we were doing, and I just was a little bit concerned that, you know, we had bitten off quite a bit. The mayor from day one was very optimistic, and he was in the end very right. But I will say, you know, of course it's about the resource and the money, but it's so much about the fact that this city cares and that the corporate community stepped up. You know, we don't want to be a city with a lot of homeless people on the street. We want a city, I think, with a civil compact where we care about each other and we try and problem solve. I think for people who are very vulnerable and who often have the biggest challenges, but often can't get into other systems. And so it's really heartening, and for us, so encouraging that the corporate community stepped up and the donors in this fund, you know, got us in. Really, we finished it, and it was almost 2 years to the day, believe it or not.
Well, sometimes it's easier to luck out with philanthropists than communities that are willing to tolerate this kind of housing in their backyard. You have a project proposed in Jamaica Plain, an area where people have also been concerned about displacement in the housing market. What has the reception been so far to the proposal?
Well, we have, you know, we've had probably 15 or 16 meetings in Jamaica Plain, including some large public meetings through the Article 80 process. And then we had a number of both formal public meetings and some informal meetings with neighbors and abutters and things like that. And I have to say, I am so grateful to the people of Jamaica Plain who came to those meetings and stood up and supported this project. It is life-changing for the people that will get this housing, life-changing. And you couldn't give a homeless person a better gift than a place of their own. And it's been really encouraging to talk with people in Jamaica Plain about this project, to see the support, and to have them, you know, show up at the, you know, at the neighborhood meetings. And you know, it takes a lot of courage sometimes to do this, and I'm very grateful to the neighbors and the people in JP for their support.
I don't want to be premature about what's going to happen with the zoning process here, but having a community where people show that degree of receptiveness to housing for the homeless, does that make a difference for what you're trying to do to help people?
Well, I think it's the crucial difference. I think it's twofold. First of all, obviously you can't get zoning relief without community support.
Even beyond the zoning decision.
Even beyond this,
yeah.
But right, so there's the very real practical you know, mechanics of going through the process with BPDA, the Article 80 process. So in order to move these projects forward, you really do need enough community support that the zoning board will support them. I think beyond that, though, the thing that I worry so much about for so many of the people we work with is they're so stigmatized sometimes that even when they try and get out of homelessness, you know, there are so many obstacles in the way. And the fact that this is a community that's welcoming people who have been homeless and there'll be a community room, a lovely community room. The community's already talking to us about, we'd like to do an art show. Could we do a little cafe there? I mean, they've had lots of ideas on how to integrate. You know, I went to St. Mary's of the Angels to talk to their parish council. And at the end of the meeting, you know, you never know what people are going to say. One of the parishioners stood up and said, you know, we have a food bank and we'd like to invite, food pantry. We'd like to invite your new tenants to come to the food pantry. And by the way, you know, we'll be thinking about how we meet increased demand. I mean, you couldn't have had a more thoughtful and nicer approach. So it's the very practical piece of this, but it is also the fact that I feel the people that are moving in will be welcomed into a really diverse and lovely community.
It's like just living in a neighborhood.
Exactly, which is what everybody wants. They just want what you and I want.
We should mention, if people want to find out some more information about the campaign or other things you're doing at Pine Street Inn, you've got a website they can go to?
We do, yep, www.pinestreetin.org. Relatively just upgraded our website. There's information on there about the Way Home Fund, but also information about the rest of our services, including our job training, our shelter programs, our outreach. And if you're interested in volunteering, there's also a link on the website.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Lyndia Downie from Pine Street Inn.